While I'm waiting on the finished plywood for the plywood walls in the not-so-tiny house to finally be delivered, I figured I'd get another project that I've had in the works for months now knocked out, this skateboard bass guitar. So I've had a skateboard guitar on my to-build list for at least a year now after stumbling across this awesome skateboard Telecaster. And my buddy Ben Paik from Wobie Design, who specializes in these kind of skateboard projects, was nice enough to send me this chunk of glued up skateboards for this project a few months back. Unfortunately, the blank wasn't quite big enough to get a guitar body out of on its own, so the piece has sat in my shop since then. At least that was until the folks from the Crimson Guitars YouTube channel reached out and invited me to be a part of their annual Great Guitar Build-Off. They also offered to send me one of their kit guitar bodies to assist on the project, and I figured this project could be perfect for the skateboard blank since I could use the kit body combined with a skateboard top or cap and have enough material for a finished guitar. So I got to work on the project by resawing the skateboard blank into 3 half-inch thick pieces over the bandsaw, and my beast of a Powermatic PM1500 bandsaw made quick work of this process. After resawing, I noticed some kind of funky looking areas where the trucks had been mounted to the skateboard decks previously, and I did some layout work to figure out how I could get the cap out of these pieces while avoiding those areas. I also lined up the curve from the skateboard nose or tail sections with the curve on the horn of the bass, which I thought was a pretty cool touch aesthetically. Once I had marked out the rough areas I'd be using, I cut the cap pieces to rough length at the miter saw and then squared up one edge of one of the pieces at the table saw. Next, I jointed the edges, which would be glued together on both pieces to give me a nice tight glue line, and with that, the top was ready for glue up. To help keep the pieces aligned during the glue up, I added some painter's tape along the seam and then got the cap clamped up using this nifty new Rockler 3-way attachment which connects to most clamps and allows you to clamp the piece in the middle, which is super useful for keeping seams lined, edge banding, and adding clamping pressure to the center of a glue up, like when gluing a cap like this onto a guitar body. Anyway, while the glue dried, I could work on getting the donor base, which was this inexpensive Squier Affinity base in this case, disassembled. And it's always surprising to me when I go to price out all of the hardware and electronics for guitar projects like this and realize that it's typically a heck of a lot cheaper just to find a donor instrument rather than buying everything new, and that was the case with this bass as well. And I'm glad I ended up getting this donor instrument as it came with an additional bridge pickup which the kit bass body didn't have a pickup cavity for, and I ended up using the donor body for reference quite a bit during the project, as you'll see. So to start, I grabbed a piece of 1/2-inch Baltic birch plywood, which I could use to make a router template for those missing routed areas, and I traced the outline of the donor base onto the template. I then rough cut the template to size at the bandsaw and then got the plywood attached to the body using these super nifty stick-it dots, which are another new Rockler product designed for exactly this purpose. Next, I got a spiral flush trim bit installed in my router table and then flushed the template up with the body, which was definitely a little tricky considering the belly and arm contours changed the depth of the edges. I eventually got the template flushed up though, and after removing it from the body, I roughly marked where I'd be routing the cutouts for the pickup cavities, which again were the main purpose for this template. After marking those locations, I drilled some starter holes with a Forstner bit at the drill press, and then using more of the stick-it dots, I got the template attached to the front of the donor base. I used a smaller spiral flush trim bit in my router to flush the template with the pickup cavities, and used a couple of holdfasts to help keep the body from moving around while I was routing. Once the template was flushed up with the cavities, I also went ahead and marked out the locations for the output jack and strap buttons while I was at it. To route the cavities into the kit body with the router template, I needed to switch over to an aptly named template bit, and this shorter style of template bit is perfect for this kind of guitar body work, as otherwise, with more kind of standard length bits, your bit can be longer than the depth of the cavity you need to cut. And I set the depth on the router to match the depth of the cavities in the donor body, and then got to routing, which went smoothly. After routing, I transferred the locations for the strap buttons and output jack, and while I had the template attached, I also transferred the hole locations for the neck mounting screws to the kit body at the drill press. And you'll also probably notice that this kit body didn't come with the belly contour and arm contour already added, and that's because I asked the guys at Crimson Guitars not to add those because I knew I was going to be gluing on that top cap. Unfortunately, the radius of the bearing on the template bit I used didn't quite allow me to route as tight to the template in the corners for the bridge pickup, so I had to clean those corners up by hand later on, but otherwise this process was perfect for transferring these pockets to the new body, and now I have a template for a P-base should I ever want to build another one. With that done, I could turn my attention back to the skateboard cap, and the glue was dry at this point, so I could get to flattening it over at the drum sander. And I did try to run this piece through the planer, but it didn't leave a great finish on this skateboard edge grain. It's essentially edge grain plywood at this point, so I went with my trusty Powermatic PM2244 drum sander here instead. After cleaning up the cap, I also needed to remove some thickness from the kit body to account for the thickness I'd be adding with the cap, and I could use the planer to remove the bulk of the material here, since the spiral cutter head on my Powermatic 20HH planer left a nearly perfect surface on this ash body. And I was looking for a final thickness of just over 1/4 of an inch for the cap, so I removed close to that amount at the planer and then got to my final thickness at the drum sander. With that, it was time to glue the body and cap together, but first I wanted to remove some of the bulk from the cap so that it'd be easier to flush up the two pieces later. I laid out the location again on the cap, and after tracing out the shape, I cut the cap to rough size using the jigsaw. To keep the cap from sliding around during the glue up, I decided to add 2 locating screws, and I made sure to place them in areas where the screw holes wouldn't be visible in the finished body, which was in the pickup cavity and the neck pocket in my case. I pre-drilled and countersunk the holes using a countersink bit, and then drove in the screws just to make sure everything looked good before adding glue. I then rolled on the glue using this super handy glue roller from Rockler, and it's really important to have nice even glue coverage on a glue up like this, as otherwise the seam between the two pieces won't look good in the finished piece. After adding the glue to both pieces, I put the cap in place and added the locating screws, and then I could get the body loaded into my vacuum bag. And there are obviously a ton of ways you could clamp something like this, including one of those 3-way clamp attachments, but since I have one, I went with my vacuum bag since it applies perfectly even pressure across the entire piece. This particular vacuum bag, which is made by Roar Rocket, is pretty unique, as you can use it with a motorized vacuum pump with this little Rockler adapter, or you can use a hand pump to remove the air for a much cheaper, lower tech option. And since the one-way valve on the bag only allows air out, you don't have to maintain a constant vacuum pressure with a pump, which is pretty cool. So I wanted to keep the same kind of skateboard veneer theme going on the headstock, which meant I needed to remove some thickness from the front face of the headstock to account for the skateboard veneer. And this was a pretty tricky task, and initially I thought I'd try a technique from the Fletcher Handcrafted Guitar YouTube channel, which is an excellent resource for guitar building, and tried to set up my oscillating belt sander to remove some of the thickness. And I felt like this was going to end poorly, so I switched gears and decided to just resaw the small amount off of the headstock over the bandsaw, which worked great. And I used a feather board just to make sure the headstock stayed nice and tight against the fence, and then used this Rockler miter gauge to make a cross cut to remove that piece. With the piece removed, I could work on dimensioning the piece of veneer I'd be adding, which only needed to be about 1/8 of an inch thick. And thankfully the cutoff piece could act as my template for figuring out which section of the skateboard offcut I wanted to use, and then I brought the piece down to final thickness at the planer and drum sander. After thicknessing, I rough cut the shape of the headstock veneer at the bandsaw and also sanded the face of the headstock at the oscillating belt sander a little bit just to clean it up before the glue up. I used that same Rockler glue roller to apply the glue and then got the veneer clamped to the headstock, which was a little awkward because it wanted to keep slipping around on me. And I should have used a few cut-off brad nails as locating pins here, but didn't think I'd have this much trouble, but thankfully I eventually got everything clamped up tightly. I left both glue ups to dry overnight, and the next day I could get the body pulled out of the vacuum bag, and as expected I ended up with an essentially perfect glue up. Next, I flush trimmed the cap with the body at the router table, and this is always one of the coolest parts of any guitar project in my opinion, when the body finally starts looking like you've been picturing it in your head. With that done, I needed to remove some thickness from the cap to make sure the pockets, most importantly the neck pocket, ended up at the correct depth. And I started at the planer, but was again getting some chip out around the edges. To help with this, I added a quick chamfer to the edges of the cap off camera, which prevented the majority of the chip out, and got the body down to rough thickness at the planer before finalizing the thickness at the drum sander. Once that was done, I could route out the pickup cavities, again drilling a starting hole for the flush trim bit using a Forstner bit, and then flush trimming. And this bit was actually part of what determined how much of the kit body I could plane down originally, since I had to have enough material left for the bearings on the flush trim bit to ride on. As I mentioned, the template bit's cutting radius wasn't tight enough for this bridge pickup cavity, so I came back and squared up those corners with a chisel, which I must say was a little bit nerve-wracking in this close to finish-ready top. Thankfully this went smoothly and I could move on to some of the other odds and ends left on the body, including drilling the hole for the output jack. And since this hole is covered by the metal jack plate, it didn't have to be absolutely perfect, and I just drilled it out using a Forster bit. Next, I marked a center line on the edge of the body and got the mounting holes for the jack plate drilled using a self-centering drill bit. I then drilled the holes a little deeper to account for the length of the jack plate screws, and then I could get the jack plate test fit, and thankfully it fit great. And I repeated a similar process to drill the holes for the strap buttons and then got those temporarily installed as well. Next, I needed to drill a through hole from the bridge pickup cavity to the electronics cavity for running the pickup wiring, and I pulled out a long 1/4-inch drill bit for this. Unfortunately, the drill chuck scuffed the top a bit during this process, but thankfully it was nothing a little sanding couldn't fix.
Oh man, flippin' dang it.
With that done, the body was ready to start getting prepped for finish, and I started by adding a fairly heavy chamfer to the edges of the body. I also really like how the chamfer ends right at the seam between the cap and the body, which gives the edge just a super clean look. Once the body was chamfered, I could flush trim the neck pocket, which I had waited on until this point, as otherwise the chamfer bit wouldn't have had anything to reference in those areas. Finally, with the neck pocket cleaned up, I could test fit the neck on the body, and I was getting pretty excited with how this base was looking. Next, I set the body aside and got back to work cleaning up the neck, starting by flushing up the veneer with the headstock using a flush trim bit. I somehow didn't get footage of this process, but I think you can imagine how that looked at this point. Once that was done, I could start getting some of the other hardware installed, starting with that bridge pickup, and I had a new clear pick guard on order, so I held off on attaching the split coil pickups at this point, and went ahead and got the neck screwed to the body so I could get the bridge located and installed. Once again, because I had that donor body for reference, this was a super easy process of marking the location of the centermost mounting screw on the bridge, using a self-centering drill bit to drill that hole, attaching the bridge, squaring it to the body, and then drilling the rest of the holes. And I did need to use a second drill bit here to drill the holes to full depth, but once that was done, I could attach the bridge to the body. Next, I got the holes for the tuners drilled out on the veneer on the headstock, and I did clamp on a backer board here to help prevent blowout since I was drilling from the back. I also used a countersink bit just to clean up the holes a little bit more, not that they'll be at all visible in the finished base since these tuners have these press-fit sleeves for these holes. And with that, all that was left was everyone's favorite part of guitar building, sanding. First, I needed to clean up the face of the headstock veneer, particularly where the veneer met up with the headstock near the nut, and thankfully the oscillating belt sander was perfect for this task. And I just worked my way up through the grits, also cleaning up the edges of the headstock while I was at it. Once that was done, I did some more hand sanding and random orbit sanding to break the sharp edges and also remove the finish from the neck, and then it was on to sanding the body. And I think the most annoying part about sanding guitar bodies is the fact that, for the most part, you have to hand sand everything. And all of the tight curves around the horns are particularly annoying, but thankfully, this body was pretty clean right from Crimson Guitars, and all in all, I didn't have to do a ton of work here. Once the sanding was done, I could get my finish of choice, Total Boat Halcyon water-based varnish, loaded into my HVLP gun, and I really love spraying this Total Boat Halcyon, and it sprays beautifully with just a tiny bit of thinning with water. And I think my favorite thing about Halcyon is it dries in about an hour, so I was able to get 4 coats of finish on in an afternoon. I sanded with 320 grit after the second coat just to knock down the raised grain, and I also sprayed the same finish on the headstock, taping off the fretboard and the rest of the neck, since I personally don't like much of a finish on my necks. With that, I let the finish cure for a few days before getting everything assembled and wired up. And I also needed to run a ground wire to the bridge, which I had forgotten to drill a hole for prior to finishing. I also did a little bit of setup work, although most of my setup tools are meant for guitar neck scale lengths and guitar strings. And finally, once that was done, I could get a little sound demo recorded for y'all, but keep in mind, I am not a bass player. All right, hopefully you guys enjoyed this one. I had a ton of fun on this build. So I've been a guitarist since I was like 13, but have somehow never owned a bass. So it's been a lot of fun playing around with this instrument. Unfortunately, I'm not gonna get to keep it. As you guys might've seen earlier in the video, all of the instruments as part of this Great Guitar Build-Off Invitational are being auctioned off for charity. I went with the Pride Foundation as my charity. I just so happened to build this during Pride Month, and it's a rainbow bass, so it seemed very fitting. I'm super supportive of the LGBTQ community. If you guys want to bid on this auction, I'll have links to the auction down in the video description below. We're also shipping it anywhere in the world. The folks at Crimson Guitars are covering the shipping costs, so you guys can bid no matter where you're at. We will get this thing to you. Also down in the video description below, I'll have links to all the tools and materials I use throughout this video as always. And last, if it's your first time here, why not go ahead and get subscribed and ring that little notification bell so you don't miss my future videos. In case you guys have been following along with the Not So Tiny House series, I will be getting back to that starting next week. I've basically been held up waiting on the finished plywood for the rest of the walls on the inside of the house. Thank you guys for hanging in there and being patient. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video, and I think that's gonna do it. So until next week, happy building.